And we are back, ready to begin our final session of today's virtual forum on the subject, the role of ESG in restoring global economic health. Today, we have joining us via Zoom three outstanding speakers, Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta, the Chief of the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR, Kun Aphinya Siranart, Head of Exploration, United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, and Ms. Cosima Stahr, Senior Advisor and Co-Lead for Finance with Adelphi Research. Sawadee krap. It's nice to have you all joining us here today. It's an honor to welcome you to our forum here today. First off, I'd like to ask each of you, what is being done by each of your institutions to encourage companies to become more sustainable with the use of ESG strategies? May I start with Kun Marco?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would really like to thank you very much for the invitation and the great opportunity to give the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reductions to be part of this important conversation. And in fact, this is a growing industry, is an important conversation ahead, shaping the future. And also, congratulations for the anniversary, of course. But before I get into that, let me give you a couple of numbers that can help frame the context of the discussion. In 2015, the United Nations member states adopted the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, covering the years 2015 to 2030. And that was a major international agreement reached at the same time with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement for climate change. And the government of Thailand really played a fundamental role, a major role in securing such an important agreement. Now, we are in the midterm of the Sendai framework, 2022, and things are not really going as expected, rather the opposite. What do I mean by that? Is that the current projections indicate that by 2030, instead of having a reduction of losses and risk, as that is the intent and the purpose of the agreement, we're going to have an increase by 40%. That means almost like 1.5 disasters a day. Economic losses have risen in the last 30 years by 145%, so more than double. The Asia-Pacific regions loses 1.5 GDP, percent of GDP per year. That is a massive amount of money that instead could go for economic and social development of our countries and communities. And in fact, the SDGs are projected to be reached in the Asia-Pacific region by 2065 instead of 2030. So clearly something is not really going the way it should. Droughts will double by 2030. Extreme temperature events will probably triple. And also in Thailand, of course, a higher number of people may be exposed to floods. So clearly, what is emerging is that disaster risk has become a very complex business because it is the resilience of our people, our communities, our business is impacted by not only natural hazard, but as we can see also with the COVID-19 pandemic, by biological hazard. And as we can see from the price spikes, for instance, the energy now due to the war in Ukraine, you can tell that the very same concept of resilience is being reshaped. Disaster risk cuts across national borders, cuts across basically areas of business, and we have a fundamental choice ahead of us. Either we want a future that is fundamentally defined by disasters, or we take courageous steps and we shape up a different pathway, and basically we change our business practices so that we can really pursue the resilience and the development that we really want. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic in and of itself has been a painful yet an important opportunities for us at hand. And my office, the University for Disaster Risk Reduction, together with many other partners, immediately during the beginning of the pandemic, really worked very, very closely with UN colleagues, governments, and other external partners to develop a number of tools to help, for instance, small and medium enterprises to assess the risk during the pandemic, take the necessary measure. And this was also aimed at the informal sector. So really looking at the resilience of the community as deep as possible. And it was also developed the so-called quick resilience estimate tool, which was a very web-based, very quick tools that could help managers, small entrepreneurs to understand the risks that were exposed and identify immediately some of the measures that they could take. But of course, we have been also working with a number of countries to reassess their national strategies to make sure that they were really multi-hazard, not only focused on natural hazards. And this was graced to another important international agreement that was secured, again, with the help of the government of Thailand, the so-called Bangkok principles for the implementation of the health aspects of the Sendai framework, which were adopted with quite a big foresight back in 2016 here in Bangkok. And that is exactly the type of measures that can help the resilience of business, the resilience of countries and communities. Maybe I can stop here, and then I also give the opportunity to Mike to go there.
Sure. I'd like to ask Kun Aphinya about what about the UNDP's efforts to help companies become more sustainable in reaching these ESG strategies?
Thank you very much for inviting UNDP to join this seminar, and thanks so much for the question. And may I start by framing the question slightly different. So instead of asking we, UNDP in Thailand in particular, have been doing to encourage companies to become more sustainable using ESG strategy, I'd rather answering it what we've been doing to encourage companies to become more sustainable by adopting the Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs. And let me explain why. And here's come the first initiative that we've been working on with key industry players, regulators over the past few years, which is to raise awareness and advocate for the shift from regular ESG practices to integrating SDG impact in business and investment strategies. Why? As all of you know, even though ESG is quite a big topic today among investors, business, actually there's no consensus on the exact list of issues, and different schools define the list of ESG issues and then maturity differently. So for example, under the E element, environmental issue itself, one school may define it as climate change, carbon emissions, all the way to natural resource use, while others might also focus on energy, water management, pollution, waste, and so on. On the S itself, the focus could be anything on human rights, workforce health, safety, diversity, inclusion, and the list go on and on. So while ESG guidelines does provide us a good starting point for sustainable business, it is not enough to help unlock the enormous capability and financing of the private sector. As a driver of sustainability practice and impact, the ESG taxonomy is rather weak, and the criteria for sustainability itself are not ambitious enough. So unlike ESG, SDGs have the potential to address all these issues, these challenges, by providing the level of ambition, the globally agreed definitions, and measures for setting impact goals and tracking progress against them. And most importantly, if you look at the goal itself, they are all linked to a more integrated development agenda that demand large-scale financing. So instead of looking at ESG, companies should look at the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals as an overarching framework for them to shape, communicate, and report their strategies, goals, and activities. And secondly, what we are doing is to support companies to measure, manage, and report their impacts in the sustainability report. So to link to what I mentioned earlier on the first point, we need to shift from ESG-based policy and process to SDGs as impact objective. So at UNDP, we are developing tools building on the globally recognized impact framework called Impact Management Project or IMP to help enterprise better measure and manage their sustainability contribution. So personally, I believe that for business to be able to operate sustainably, you need to understand your business process, have a proper risk management plan, and all this can be done through setting up impact metrics and starting having an impact management framework in place. And by doing so, it should allow you to go beyond simply understanding by enabling you to determine gaps and way to address them and improve your business over time. So for those of you who might not really be familiar with this concept, impact management in a simplest term is the process of measuring and managing the creation of social and environmental impact in order to maximize the impact and optimize it while also reducing the unexpected risks that might occur. And lastly, when we talk about the sustainability, I would say people immediately think of environmental issues. There's nothing wrong with that, but I would say sustainability is broader than that. So another big pillar that UNDP have been working on is to support companies on that sustainability journey by working with the HR Human Resource Department to revise the code of conduct to become more inclusive, promoting diversity and inclusion at workplace, broadening the scope of gender equality to not just include women, but also LGBT group, advocating for business and human rights within the company supply chains, good governance, business integrity, and the list go on. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Kun Aphinya. Kun Cosima, I would like to ask you, we understand Adelphi has made efforts to make the Asia region more environmentally friendly, and wanted to ask you, what has been done to help restore the company from the current health crisis and all the while taking the environment into consideration?
Yes, thank you very much, Kunjak. In fact, Adelphi is a Berlin-based environmental consultancy. So that's also the topic that we focus on, of course, in our projects. And what we do is typically we work with governments as well as the private sector to together find the pain points on where progress is lacking towards achieving the SDGs that Kun Aphinya so eloquently described, as well as how to overcome the planetary boundaries thinking that we currently or that is currently urgently needed, because in fact we are crossing boundaries that are important for our well-being and that really are the basis for human life on this planet. And what we do is we advise both the German government as well as other European governments as well as the European Union on how to better integrate ESG in a, let's say, overall policy setup that allows companies to really go forward in an opportunity-driven way and develop their strategies not based on, let's say, limits thinking, but rather on opportunities thinking, to allow a transformation to greener economies and also more equitable societies.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go back to Kun Marco. Your previous answer really pointed to a sense of urgency in that in some ways we are not heading in the right direction, especially with the goals related to reducing greenhouse gases and trying to mitigate the rise in overall global temperatures. And I wanted to ask about, with this sense of urgency looming over us, how are you helping to promote more awareness about these ESG investments in order to incorporate resilience within the companies themselves, but also that would have synergistic effects with society in general?
Yes. No, thank you for that. This is a fundamental question, in fact. We're not only going a wrong direction, we're really going the opposite direction. That is really scary. Now, the good news, though, is that there is an increasing number of entrepreneurs that are really willing to get the right way. A fundamental issue, it can be simply highlighted by the fact that investment in preventions and investment in resilience are still extremely limited. By analogy or comparison, we can tell that 0.5% of official development assistance, so we're speaking about public funding in support of funds, but 0.5% is going for prevention and disaster risk reduction. So clearly, this is something not working in the way investments are currently made. At the same time, of course, the ESG has represented a fundamental way. It can be further enhanced, as my colleagues Aphinya and Cosima were saying, in terms of aligning that system toward the SDGs. The fundamental point here is that and the question is, are we really measuring what we value? Mm-hmm. And there is a bit of a gap there between the value system that is changing in light of the sense of emergency and the system that we have in place to measure whether progress is really taking place on the things that we value. And we can certainly tell that the current system underestimate risks big time, and at the same time also undervalue key assets such as biodiversity. I think that there was an interesting study done by the Central Bank of the Netherlands, which basically found that 36% of the portfolio was exposed to risk to natural hazards. So it is by taking such measures that we can really highlight what's the status of the assets where we have the investment focused on. And obviously, if we follow this train of thoughts, we definitely need to invest much more in disaster risk reduction. We need to see that disaster risk reduction investments is not a cost; it's really an investment with high return. Some say 6 times, 7 times, some people say 10 times. So clearly, is much more. And the problem that we have in terms of calculating the losses is that there are often a very big underestimates, sometimes up to 50% underestimate, if we consider the so-called small-scale disasters, which are the ones that hit a community and not necessarily come to the attention of the nation as a whole, but for the communities that are impacted, these are fundamental losses. So it's really helping companies, and there is the UNDP for Disaster Risk Reduction as a network of companies called Arise, basically a movement of companies in a number of countries aiming at strengthening investment in disaster risk reduction along the supply chain. And it's precisely through the leadership of these entrepreneurs that it's possible to integrate increasingly this cut on prevention in the investments. This should also lead toward a further refinement, I would say, of the ESG in terms of being able to capture much better the risk and the disaster risk as not hazard by hazard, but in the integrated and cascading impact that it has. Of course, it's not an easy way, but technology, local and indigenous knowledge combined are a great asset that can help precisely understanding how that can be done. And it also was hinted by my colleagues, there is a very strong correlation between disaster risk reduction and human rights protection. And this is something that can be further utilized. And of course, is an important aspect of cooperation between the public and the private sector. And my colleagues, for instance, UNDP in Thailand have been doing a lot of very important work, including also UN Women, to enlarge, for instance, the number of women leadership in companies and so on and so forth. That also leads to the question of investment in nature-based solutions. I would be happy to further expand on that because that is also goes very close to the matter of your question, but I don't want to steal the space to my colleagues. So back to you, and then if there is time, I can elaborate more on that.
Thank you, Kun Marco. Actually, my next question to Kun Aphinya was about how she felt with regards to UNDP's objectives with helping nations developing their sustainable investing in Thailand. But what really struck me about your previous answers, how you felt that the concept of the ESG wasn't going far enough, especially in relation to the SDGs or the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so I want to ask you about how is that progressing in developing understanding within Thailand about these Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes, so maybe I touched on the point I mentioned about like the sentiment around the Thai market, which is still around ESGs. So I would say at least on the positive side, many companies that I've been talking to, they're super active on sustainability. Everyone wants to do something, but when you look at the way that they're doing it, they're still based on ESG, meaning that they are doing the activities. Some of them doing it as a side project, CSR. Some of them starting to integrate into the business. But when you look at the report, what we are trying here at UNDP, that we are trying to advocate is that it's not enough for you to just tick the box, do the checklist of ESG that I'm doing XYZ, process XYZ, that's not enough. We need to see the impact. And that's why we advocate for the SDGs as kind of like a big framework for them to be able to measure the impact. Because when you talk about the impact, you have another set of KPI that you have to achieve. And this is what we are trying to shift the momentum here. And we've been working so hard with the Security and Exchange Commission of Thailand to really under the one report framework for the companies that, it's not enough to just list out what you are doing, but you have to measure the impact. And now turning back to another questions on the sustainable investment, I have to say this question couldn't be more timely, as just yesterday, UNDP, the Security and Exchange Commission of Thailand, and the Center for Impact Investing and Practice under Temasek Trust were launching the SDG Investor Map for Thailand. But before I explain what the map is and what UNDP has been trying to do to promote sustainable investment, let me share my own observation on the market momentum here in Thailand first. So I would say we have seen a clear, strong commitment on sustainable finance from both the finance minister, key regulators, like the Bank of Thailand, the Security and Exchange Commission, or even among large banks and asset management firms. So for example, last year, the working group on the sustainable finance, which consists of the Fiscal Policy Office under the Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Thailand, the Security and Exchange Commission, the Office of Insurance Commissions, and the Stock Exchange, has jointly published the Sustainable Finance Initiative for Thailand to set the direction and framework for driving sustainable finance across the financial sector. Similarly, from the private sector side, and this is something that UN country team also supported, 43 Thai financial institutions, or the big names, they signed a statement of commitment to sustainable Thailand. Not only that the side parties commit to building their capacity and awareness on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, but they also note the UN principle of responsible banking, the principle of responsible investments as a comprehensive framework for them when they're doing banking and investment. So this is a good sign. And I think, these initiatives are very promising. And compared to other countries in Asia, we are quite advanced on the policy front. However, for me, when we look at the implementation level, I still see quite a big gap in translating these policy commitments into action, like actually mobilizing private capital and developing new innovative financing instruments towards SDGs. And when I talk to investors, they often told me that, they have money, like a lot of being short of money, and they are ready to invest. But the real challenges are the lack of investment-ready opportunities. Investor find is extremely difficult to identify the projects which align with the sustainability concept to invest in. And Thailand is not alone. This is a typical challenge among investors around the world. And that's why at UNDP, we see this gap in market intelligence. And hence, we've been supporting over 20 countries now across the world in developing the SDG Investor Map, including Thailand. And we just launched it yesterday. So basically, the map is a market intelligence that helps translating the country-level SDG gaps and priorities into private sector investment opportunities and bankable projects by providing data that help highlight the business opportunities as well as the expected development impact of such investment. So if you ask whether the sustainable investment has really become a norm, I would say yes right away. But there are no reason why it shouldn't be, right? As we all know, achieving the SDGs requires significant investment, and the current level of investment by the government alone is not enough to meet the target that we have set to achieve by 2030. So statistically, achieving the SDG will take around like 5 to 7 trillion US dollars annually, with an investment gap of about like 2.5 trillion in developing countries. So that's why we really need to unlock this new source of finance, especially from the private sector. And at UNDP, we believe in the potential of sustainable finance and been working closely with the governments and private sector partners to experiment new instruments and innovative approach to direct investment for SDGs. Like from sustainable and responsible investment all the way to blended finance instrument like green bonds, corporate venturing, and you name it. So, in addition to the map itself, there are also another initiative that we've been doing to support the mobilization of the private capital for the SDGs, which is the SDG Impact Standard. So basically, we are trying to strengthen the investment impact management practice to developing the assurance standard for private equities, bonds, and enterprise, and to help them guide investors and enterprise that they can really use these standards to facilitate their investment and make sure that the products that they are doing really align with SDGs. Well, we don't have much time today, but if the audience are interested in looking at all the tools, the standard that we have, I'm more than happy to share later. Please feel free to reach out to UNDP.
Thank you, Kun Aphinya. Actually, my next question for Kun Cosima may relate to this. I'd like to ask you about how international green finance works.
That's a very good question. So let's maybe split green finance into two. One would be public sector finance and the other would be private sector finance. And maybe I will just quickly have a look at the private sector side, because I think Kun Aphinya made a very good point in focusing on the SDGs. And I would also emphasize that ESG, where it stands now, is based on two assumptions that are actually not fully applicable. So assumption number one would be that ESG disclosures influence investment decisions. And the assumption two would be that ESG disclosures help investors generally to contribute to a transformation towards a low carbon, circular, and minimal impact economy. But the problem is that only very few private investors are willing to give up return, even if they recognize that risks are better managed by firms that do have an ESG strategy. And this is also true for rating providers, where the ESG assessment is based on metrics that are really limited to the financially material risks to the one company that they are assessing. So the physical, reputational, regulatory, and transition risks. And Ms. Marco was also referring to this. So we can have a company that is by its ESG assessment optimally placed, while at the same time causing for other companies and entire societies huge problems in the longer term. And this is why I also appreciate the focus on SDGs here that is provided by UNDP. The problem gets even greater if we look at central banks and financial regulators, because they also then take up this narrow focus on the risks of balance sheets of singular firms, rather than the impacts that finance has on the natural world in general. And of course, this limits the accuracy of impact assessment through ESG and corporate strategies. And while they can be precise, the companies report precise numbers, they do not really matter in terms of planetary boundaries or SDG achievement. So what is really needed is that these financial sector norms just become more generally right and more generally relevant. Otherwise, we have this alphabet soup of ESG institutions and assessment providers, etc., without really solving the starting point problem of the planetary boundaries and SDG achievement. And I think one way out, this was also alluded to by Kun Aphinya, is of course to support ESG with a more general strategy that can be national, that can also be international. And for example, in the EU, there is the EU Green Deal as a flanking and supporting strategy, as well as the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which kind of promotes also the purposes of the EU Green Deal. And you can see in the action plan right there on the slide that, of course, it builds on ESG reporting by companies. It builds on precise data. It builds on the competence of actors to analyze these data. But it's not a purpose on its own. It is really embedded into a system and into, let's say, a perspective shift also of what can be expected of financial sector actors.
Okay, thank you for that very detailed and very interesting answer about the international green finance and how it relates to ESG efforts. Now, I'd like to ask each of you to, in the time that we have remaining, very briefly give your perspective on what Thailand needs to do specifically to meet its goals with regards to ESG or SDGs. Kind of starting with you, Mr. Marco.
Yeah, thank you. This is something that is, I guess, that is not only for Thailand, but also for other countries. I think the huge capital that we have here in Thailand is the commitment and the expertise that is putting behind this. And that is highly commendable. And I think that what needs to be done a little bit more, again, not only in Thailand, but I would say across the spectrum, is to have stronger regulations for risk disclosure. That is absolutely a must. We need to have much more interoperable systems in terms of data use, architecture and use between public and private, and especially when it comes between the economic world and the disaster world, because they both use the word risk in common, but in fact, slightly different things are also understood. So there is a need to reconcile the concept behind and the practices behind these words, and fundamentally the data that can help the decision-making process, because disasters are fundamentally the results of our wrong choices, and therefore it's really in our hands to take action. And then the last point, which is connected also to this risk disclosure in public and private transactions and in balance sheets, is an increasingly stronger engagement of the regulators, whether it's banking, insurance, or security commissions. Their role is really vital, and I would also call the role of the national audit institutions, which can also really play a fundamental role in advancing in this perspective. So with this,
okay.
Stop and I thank you.
Okay, Kun Aphinya, your perspective on very briefly what Thailand needs to do right away?
Well, I would say back to the very basic, which is the awareness raising. Because when you talk about the SDGs, many still don't even know what it is. And as you know, SDGs is not the government responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility. And the private sector, they hold a kind of like a lot of potential to really help the country to address SDG gaps. And let's imagine, if the whole private sector, not just the big listed companies like the set 50, set 100, but really the whole market, SMEs, all the way to social enterprise startups. If everyone understand that when they do the business, they have to have another lens, another KPI, which is based on the sustainability. I think, imagine the impact of that. And if they do it, not just for the sake of PR, but they do it because they want to create impact. And this is not another burden. I've been listening to previous speakers. Some of them say that it's costly. Some of them say it's not. But actually, I would say, if you look at SDGs, they actually help you identify new business opportunities. It will help you unlock and scale up your business. At the same time, by doing so, integrating impact lens in your business, it's also help the countries as they address the SDG gaps. So, business can really do well by doing good.
Thank you, Kun Aphinya. And finally, Ms. Cosima, from a Berlin-based company that has the perspective of what's been going on in Europe, what do you think that Thailand can do right away to meet its goals in ESG?
Well, I think really the focus should be on opportunities here, and also to, even if right now, of course, economic recovery must come first, to do so to plan, to strategize from a longer term perspective, so that there is really a more sophisticated engagement with ESG and also sustainability issues at large. And this can and will also help to really understand stakeholder expectations for companies, better management of resources, and also in the development of long-term strategies, which can bring this increased resilience, corporate resilience that everybody is also looking for, and can lead the R&D and innovation efforts of companies. And of course, it would also be really important for Thailand to understand the dynamic international policy space around ESG, because things have been moving quite fast. And as a country that is interested both in foreign direct investment, as well as on the top of the list with regards to regional ETFs, it's really important to be up to speed on the most recent developments in the ESG space, while at the same time also understanding the limits that the ESG approach has.
Okay, thank you very much, Kun Cosima. And thank you to all of our speakers, Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta, Chief of the Regional Office of Asia and the Pacific, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR, Kun Aphinya Siranart, Head of Exploration for United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, and Ms. Cosima Stahr, Senior Advisor and Co-Lead for Finance at Adelphi Research. We really do appreciate your urgency and insight into these important matters. Thank you to all of our speakers who have joined us today for a wonderful and informative program. In addition, we would like to thank our sponsors for their kindness in supporting this program. First, we have Jaran Pokpan Group, or CP Group. We have Global Compact Network Thailand, or GCNT. AIA Company Limited, One Bangkok, Bangkok Industrial Gas Company Limited, or BIG, and Mitsubishi Motors Thailand. Thank you again to all of our sponsors. Finally, I want to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today and participated in today's forum. You can rewatch the forum in case you've missed parts of it or want to review what was said by our speakers on our website, on YouTube, and in Facebook. The next international virtual forum will be focusing on the theme of transition energy. Growing economies are also grappling with the issue of how to increase energy access while maintaining economic growth and transitioning to more environmentally friendly energy options. We will be hearing from leading voices from Thailand and beyond as they address themes of global significance for the nation. And please be sure not to miss any of the ensuing discussions of these vital matters. We wish you all a great day, and we will see you at the next session of the online forum. I am Jack Parinya Rupapan. Sawadee krap.